It started with something so small. A simple request on a midnight flight. Would you switch seats? Yet, within an hour, that request exploded into a confrontation at 35,000 feet. A confrontation that would not only humiliate a brilliant black woman, but ground an entire international airline operation. This is the story of Dr. Maya Ellison, a woman of quiet authority, a woman who had spent her life designing the very safety systems that keep airplanes in the sky. And yet, in the first-class cabin of Flight 729, she was treated not as a pioneer, not even as an equal passenger, but as someone who did not belong. How could a calm refusal to give up her rightful seat transform into accusations of being a safety threat? Why did silence fall from those who witnessed it? And how did one woman, with a single phone call, bring one of the world's largest airports to a standstill? You're about to hear a story that will make you question authority, challenge injustice, and remind you that dignity is power. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe so you never miss a story that exposes truth and demands justice. The cabin of SkyWest Global Flight 729 glowed in a warm, muted light. The Dreamliner's windows dimmed to a soft shade of blue, and the scent of freshly warmed towels drifted through the first-class cabin. The hum of the engines was steady, almost like a low heartbeat beneath the floor, a reminder that this aircraft was carrying them away from San Francisco and into the open skies bound for London. Dr. Maya Ellison sat in seat 2A, her preferred window seat. She had chosen it months ago, the same way she always did before international conferences. For her, watching the city shrink beneath the clouds was not just a ritual, it was a form of meditation. At 52, Maya carried herself with a stillness that came not from passivity but from deep strength. She had learned long ago that true authority did not need to shout. It radiated from presence, from the quiet clarity in her eyes, from the discipline of her thoughts. Her salt and pepper curls framed her face, and her dark eyes held a kind of calm focus. She wore a navy blazer, simple pearl earrings, and a pair of glasses that gave her the air of someone who was always watching, always analyzing. And in truth, she was. Maya was more than a passenger on this flight. She was a professor of aeronautical engineering, a woman who had spent decades designing safety protocols, consulting for the FAA, and teaching the very captains who now commanded planes like this one. Yet, in this cabin, she was simply another traveler, quietly unfolding her leather-bound notebook, ready to jot down a few thoughts before slipping into the world of a Brahms symphony on her headphones. She let out a slow breath, her body easing into the seat as if it were an old friend. The hum of conversation was low, the clinking of glasses delicate. It was, at least for this moment, exactly what she wanted: peace. But tranquility has a way of being fragile at 30,000 feet. It can vanish with a single shadow. A figure loomed over her, cut in the soft glow from the overhead light. "Excuse me," the voice said. It was male, firm, clipped with impatience rather than courtesy. Maya lifted her eyes from her notebook. Standing in the aisle was a man who looked to be in his late 30s. His suit was tailored but wrinkled at the edges, like it had been worn one day too long. His sandy hair was slicked back, though not carefully enough to hide the tired arrogance in his posture. His name, as she would later learn, was Bradley Stone. But in that moment, he was only a stranger who already carried the aura of entitlement. Bradley gestured toward seat 2B, already occupied by a young woman arranging her laptop. "That's my colleague," he said. His voice was not a request but an announcement. "We need to sit together to go over a presentation. I'll need you to take my seat instead. It's 3C, just behind us." Maya blinked once, then let her gaze fall calmly to the boarding pass resting on her console, before returning it to his face. "I'm sorry," she said, her tone even composed. "This is my assigned seat." Bradley exhaled sharply, as if she had missed the obvious importance of his words. "Yes, I can see that, but we have work to do. This merger we're finalizing is worth millions. I'm sure you understand how important that is." His eyes scanned the cabin as if inviting the other passengers to nod in sympathy with his self-importance. The young woman in 2B, Clara Jensen, as Maya would later know, looked mortified. "Brad, it's fine," she whispered, her cheeks flushed. "We can just know." Bradley cut her off, his tone sharpening. "It's not fine. We need the space. The lady can take my seat." He gestured back toward his middle seat in row 3, as though he had solved the problem with magnanimity. Maya studied him for a long moment, her silence deliberate. Finally, she spoke with a steady clarity that carried more weight than volume. "I specifically chose this seat," she said. "I'm afraid I'm not going to move." Something flickered across Bradley's face, annoyance first, then disbelief, then the early stages of anger. His jaw tightened. "Look," he said, lowering his voice as though attempting patience. "I don't think you understand. This is important. My comfort," Maya replied, "is also important to me." She did not raise her voice. She did not frown. She simply stated a fact, her tone flat and calm, but unshakable. The simplicity of her refusal struck him harder than any argument might have. It was as if she had dismissed not just his request, but his entire hierarchy of priorities. His face flushed, and his fingers curled around the seat back, gripping tighter than necessary. The hum of the cabin seemed to quiet. A nearby passenger coughed awkwardly. Another shifted in their seat. The first ripple of tension had entered the calm water. Clara's eyes darted nervously between them, her lips parting as if to speak, then closing again. She looked small beside Bradley's looming presence, caught between loyalty and conscience. Maya caught her gaze for the briefest moment. There was something there, apology, embarrassment, and a quiet plea for forgiveness. But Clara said nothing. Maya returned her attention to her notebook. The conversation, at least from her perspective, was over. She adjusted her glasses, clicked her pen, and wrote a single line in her precise, looping script. Respect should not be negotiable. Bradley lingered in the aisle, unwilling to let go, his chest rising with unspent frustration. For him, this was not about a seat anymore. It was about dominance, about control, about being told no by a woman who refused to yield. And he did not yet realize that the storm he was summoning would soon spiral far beyond his control. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the crew prepared for takeoff. Somewhere in the distance, the engines roared a little louder, their pitch climbing as if foreshadowing the escalation about to come. Dr. Maya Ellison closed her notebook and slid it back into the seat pocket. She could already feel the weight of the coming conflict pressing against the fragile walls of calm. She placed her noise-canceling headphones gently over her ears, but she did not yet start the music. Instead, she sat in silence, her eyes on the window, watching the rain streaks illuminated by the airport floodlights. She knew this was not the end of it. It was only the beginning. Bradley Stone did not retreat. If anything, the refusal seemed to ignite something in him. He shifted his weight, leaning against the seat back of the row in front of him, a stance that suggested he intended to hold court right there in the aisle until he got what he wanted. His jaw clenched as he let out a huff loud enough for several nearby passengers to hear. "You really don't understand the gravity of this," he said, lowering his voice but sharpening the edges of his words. "This isn't just small talk between co-workers. This is a deal, an international merger. Tens of millions of dollars are on the line. We have to be side by side. I can't afford distractions, Dr. Maya Ellison adjusted the armrest slightly, as though creating a stronger boundary between herself and him. She met his gaze without hostility, but also without compromise. "I'm not disputing the importance of your work," she said evenly, "but your urgency does not cancel out my rights as a passenger. I purchased this seat. I chose it deliberately, and I intend to remain here." Her calmness unsettled him. He was used to people bristling, apologizing, or conceding when pressed with his kind of certainty. But Maya wasn't raising her voice. She wasn't apologizing. She was simply steady, immovable. That stillness irritated him in a way that yelling never could have. Clara Jensen, the young woman in 2B, shifted uncomfortably. She had opened her laptop and tried to act as though she were absorbed in arranging slides, but the tremor in her hands gave her away. She cast a sideways glance at Maya, then back to Bradley. Her lips parted. Hesitant. Brad. Maybe we should just Bradley cut her off with a dismissive gesture. "Clara, please. This is non-negotiable. We need to finalize our pitch before we land. You know how high stakes this is." His tone, wrapped in a patronizing veneer, silenced her before she could muster a protest. A couple of rows behind, a man pretending to scroll on his phone raised his eyebrows, clearly listening. The tension in the air was tangible now, the kind that draws people in whether they want to be involved or not. Still, no one spoke. No one wanted to be the first to intervene in a conflict that was inching toward spectacle. Maya drew a slow breath, steadying herself. She had been here before, not here in this exact seat on this exact plane, but in the countless spaces of her life where someone had assumed her presence was negotiable. At board meetings, at conferences, even in faculty lounges, where younger men with fewer credentials had spoken over her as though her words were optional. And yet she had always found that the more she met force with composure, the more uncomfortable her challengers became. It unsettled them to realize they couldn't provoke her into the role they expected the angry, unreasonable woman. "No," she thought, "not tonight. Mr. Stone," she said quietly, her voice low enough to make him lean in. "You may want to consider asking your colleague to move if this is so essential. Otherwise, you have the option to work from your own seat. My decision is final." Her words were firm, but they carried no venom. It was a wall, but not a weapon. Bradley blinked, taken aback by her refusal to engage in the tug-of-war he thought he was winning. He straightened up, his face reddening, and glanced down the aisle as though searching for backup. It came in the form of a figure approaching briskly from the galley. The flight attendant, Monica Reeves, appeared, her smile taut and professional, the kind of smile that looked practiced enough to withstand turbulence. She was in her mid-40s, her blonde hair pulled back in a neat bun, her uniform perfectly pressed. Her steps carried the confident authority of someone who had handled countless passenger squabbles before. "Is there a problem here?" Sir Monica asked, directing her attention not at Maya, but at Bradley, her tone drenched in sympathetic professionalism. She didn't even glance at Maya at first, as though she were incidental to the scene. Bradley immediately gestured toward Maya, seizing his chance. "Yes, there is. This woman is refusing to swap seats so I can work with my colleague here. It's a critical matter for my business, and she's being completely unreasonable." Monica finally turned her gaze toward Maya, and the sweetness in her smile curdled into something condescending. "Ma'am," she said, her voice tilting into the register one might use with a confused child, "it would really help if you could just accommodate him. He and his colleague need to work, and it's only for the duration of the flight. You'll still be in first class, just a row back." Surely that's not too much of an inconvenience. Maya felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the weary recognition of the script she had heard before. The unspoken assumptions hung heavy in the air that her presence in this cabin was a fluke, that she was somehow less entitled to comfort, that her voice mattered less. She looked at Monica squarely, her tone calm but unyielding. "I am in my assigned seat. I selected it months ago for a reason. I will not be moving." Monica's smile faltered. Her eyes hardened, just slightly, the mask slipping. "Ma'am, we don't want to cause a scene," she said, her voice dipped in warning. Maya arched an eyebrow, her calmness sharper than any blade. "I have no intention of causing a scene. I am simply sitting in my paid seat. The gentleman is the one making demands." For a moment, silence. The surrounding passengers shifted again, their gazes flicking between the three figures as though watching a play unfold. Some faces were sympathetic, others impatient. A few quietly pleased to witness drama that broke the monotony of waiting for takeoff. But no one spoke. Silence, Maya thought, was always the easiest form of complicity. Bradley smirked, emboldened by Monica's intervention. He crossed his arms, certain the tide had turned. Clara, however, looked pale, her eyes darting to Maya's face with something close to apology. She seemed on the verge of saying something but shrank back under Bradley's sharp glance. Maya let her eyes rest on the window for a moment, watching a streak of rain slide diagonally across the glass, illuminated by the tarmac lights inside her chest. The debate raged. Should she yield? For the sake of avoiding escalation, should she choose the path of least resistance, one she had chosen too many times before, just to move the day along? Or should she plant her feet, knowing full well the storm this might summon? She knew the cost. Standing firm against subtle prejudice had always demanded more of her than it did of those who inflicted it. The exhaustion of always having to decide, is this the battle worth fighting? But another truth anchored her resolve every time she gave in. She taught the world it could keep pressing. And tonight, she could not give it that lesson. Her hands rested calmly in her lap. Her voice, when she spoke again, was measured and unwavering. "I will not be moving," she said. "If Mr. Stone needs to work with his colleague, he has options. But I'm not one of them." Monica's smile disappeared completely now. For the first time, she looked unsettled. She exchanged a glance with Bradley, a silent alliance forming between them. And, in that moment, Maya felt the atmosphere in the cabin change, the warmth of hospitality cooling into something brittle, something dangerous. The flight attendant straightened her posture, her tone losing its polite veneer. "Ma'am, I strongly suggest you reconsider," Monica said. "If you continue to be uncooperative, I may have to call the purser." Maya closed her notebook and set it neatly on the console beside her. She turned her head, her eyes meeting Monica's with a calmness that was almost unnerving. "Please do," she said softly. "I would welcome it." For a heartbeat. The three of them stood frozen in their standoff, the entitled businessman, the condescending attendant, and the calm woman who refused to yield. Around them, the cabin seemed to hold its breath, as though sensing the storm clouds gathering just beyond the fuselage walls. And Maya knew in her bones this was far from over. The murmur of voices in the cabin dimmed as Monica Reeves stepped back, her hand raised slightly in a signal to wait. Her lips pressed into a thin line before she disappeared down the aisle toward the galley. The moment she left, silence seemed to flood the space she'd occupied, leaving only the soft hum of the Dreamliner's engines and the hushed whispers of a few curious passengers leaning just far enough to catch a glimpse. Bradley Stone straightened his shoulders, as if certain victory was only moments away. He glanced around with the smugness of a man who believed he had just summoned the cavalry. Clara Jensen remained in her seat, her eyes fixed on her laptop screen, though she hadn't typed a single word in several minutes. Her posture screamed discomfort, every muscle tight, as if she were bracing against turbulence that had not yet arrived. Maya Ellison adjusted her glasses and folded her hands neatly in her lap. Outwardly, she was still composed, every inch the image of quiet control. But inside, her thoughts flickered with unease. She had chosen this seat, this ritual, because she needed peace before her week of speaking engagements in London. She needed the clarity that came from solitude, from watching the earth fall away beneath her as she prepared to discuss aviation safety protocols with an international audience. Instead, she now found herself trapped in an all-too-familiar dance, the test of her resolve against the entitlement of others, the performance of patience in the face of condescension. She wondered just for a moment if yielding would be easier. She could move back one row, lose her view, lose her carefully chosen space, but avoid this spectacle. She could let them win this round and save herself the exhaustion of escalation. But even as the thought crossed her mind, she recognized it for what it was, the temptation of surrender. How many times in her life had she chosen that path? How many times had she swallowed indignities to keep the peace? Too many. And every concession had left her with the same bitter taste, the same question echoing inside her. What lesson did I teach them about my worth? Her gaze drifted to Clara. The young woman's face was pale, her lips pressed together, her eyes heavy with something between guilt and fear. Maya knew that look. It was the look of someone trapped by hierarchy, too afraid of their superior's wrath to speak the truth. Clara's silence was not indifference. It was survival. Maya's heart softened for her. She could see the invisible chains that kept Clara still. And then Monica returned, but she was not alone. Behind her strode Thomas Grant, the purser of the flight. His uniform was immaculate, his silver hair combed neatly, his expression carved into the mask of a man who had long ago stopped listening to nuance. He carried himself with an air of weary authority, the kind that demanded compliance without needing to justify itself. "Good evening," Thomas said, his voice projecting across the cabin. He stopped just beside Maya's row, folding his hands in front of him as though he were presiding over a courtroom. "I understand there's an issue here." Before Maya could respond, Bradley jumped in eagerly, gesturing toward her. "Yes, there is. This passenger is refusing to switch seats, so I can work with my colleague. I've explained how critical this is, and she's being completely unreasonable. Your attendant has already tried to help, but she won't cooperate." Thomas nodded gravely, his eyes flicking to Monica, who gave a subtle nod in return, reinforcing Bradley's version of events. Then his gaze landed on Maya, appraising, skeptical. "Ma'am," he said, his tone shifting to something firm, paternal. "Is that correct? You've been asked to move and are refusing." Maya kept her voice calm, even, though the injustice of the framing gnawed at her. "I am sitting in my assigned seat. I purchased this seat months ago. Mr. Stone has asked me to move so he can sit next to his colleague. I declined. That is the entirety of the situation." Thomas's lips thinned. "And yet it's become disruptive," he said. The word weighted like a stone. "You understand we need cooperation in the cabin. If a reasonable request is made, it helps everyone if passengers are willing to compromise." Maya leaned back slightly, her eyes steady on his. "With respect, a reasonable request is not one that requires me to surrender what I have rightfully paid for. The disruption, as you call it, is not coming from me." Her voice was soft, but the precision of her words cut through the stale cabin air. A few passengers shifted in their seats, glancing at one another, though still no one spoke aloud. Bradley let out a sharp laugh. "You hear this? She's twisting it like she's the victim. I'm trying to run a business deal here. Millions are on the line, and she's just what read in a notebook." Clara flinched, her eyes darting toward him in alarm. "Brad, please," she whispered, but her words were swallowed by his bluster. Thomas exhaled slowly, as though his patience were wearing thin. "Ma'am, I'm asking you once more. Can you please move to seat 3C? It's just one row back. You'll still be in first class. This doesn't have to escalate further." The temptation flickered again. One row back, a middle seat, less comfort, less peace. But peace wasn't the real cost. It was dignity, and dignity was not negotiable. Maya's fingers tightened around the edge of her armrest, her internal dialogue roaring louder now. "If you say yes, you'll be invisible again. If you say no, you'll be painted as difficult. Either way, they win. But which choice allows you to look at yourself tomorrow?" She lifted her chin slightly, her voice calm but ringing with conviction. "No, I will not be moving. I have the right to sit in the seat I purchased. If Mr. Stone's work is so urgent, he has the option to trade with his colleague or conduct it from his assigned seat." The words hung in the air, sharp and final. Bradley's face flushed crimson, his fists clenching at his sides. Monica shifted uneasily, her earlier confidence cracking, and Thomas Grant's expression hardened into something cold, authoritative, unyielding. "Very well," he said, his tone dropping an octave. "If you refuse to comply with the crew's request, then we may have no choice but to involve the captain." A collective breath rippled through the cabin. Passengers leaned in, eyes wide, sensing the drama approaching its next stage. Maya's heart pounded, but her face remained serene. She knew what was coming. She had seen this pattern too many times, the escalation, the framing, the attempt to make her defiance into a disruption. But this time, she would not fold. She turned her gaze to the window, her voice soft but resolute. "Then, please do." For a moment, the hum of the engines was the only sound, steady and indifferent. The rain outside streaked across the glass, illuminated by the glow of floodlights, and within the cabin, The storm tightened its grip, preparing to break open. Thomas Grant did not waste time. After Maya's calm refusal, he gave a sharp nod to Monica Reeves and moved briskly toward the front galley. His stride was purposeful, clipped, and loud enough that the shuffle of his polished shoes carried through the first-class cabin. Passengers turned their heads as if watching the opening act of a drama they had not bought tickets for but could not look away from. Maya Ellison sat motionless, her gaze lingering on the raindrops sliding diagonally across the window. She could hear the shifting in seats, the muffled coughs, the faint rustle of newspapers as people pretended to disengage while their curiosity devoured every detail. She felt the spotlight pressing against her skin, but her face betrayed none of it. She had learned long ago that composure was its own shield. Bradley Stone leaned closer to Clara Jensen, his voice low but brimming with triumph. "It's handled," he whispered. "The purser will set her straight." He leaned back with a smirk, as if the matter were already decided, as if Maya's quiet strength was nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. Clara's stomach knotted. She stared down at her laptop screen, the cursor blinking on a blank document. She could not focus, not with the heat of shame burning her cheeks. She wanted to speak God. She wanted to say something. She had watched the entire exchange. She knew Maya had been nothing but calm, reasonable, but Bradley's voice was the one carrying authority in this moment, and Clara had lived too long in the shadow of men, like him, not to know the cost of contradicting them. If I say something now, he'll retaliate at work, she thought. He'll make my life hell, maybe derail my entire career. But if I stay silent, what does that make me? Her fingers trembled on the keyboard. Silence tasted bitter, but fear kept it lodged in her throat. Then Thomas returned, and this time he was not alone. Captain Douglas Reed followed, his crisp white shirt gleaming under the overhead lights, epaulets catching the faint gold of the cabin glow. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades in the cockpit. His presence shifted the air instantly. Passengers sat straighter. Conversations died. Authority, absolute and undeniable, had entered the room. "Captain," Thomas began, his voice pitched for the surrounding passengers as much as for Reed. "We have a situation." Reed's eyes swept the cabin, his jaw tight. He did not look at Maya first. Instead, he turned slightly toward Thomas and Monica, listening as they recounted the story in quick, clipped tones. Bradley leaned into the aisle, adding his own commentary with theatrical frustration. To anyone watching, the tableau looked official. Procedural, a crew conferring, a passenger complaining, the captain being briefed. To Maya, it looked like something else entirely, a trial held in whispers, without her voice present. She closed her eyes briefly, inhaling slowly through her nose. She had spent her life teaching pilots about crew resource management, about the dangers of bias, about the catastrophic consequences of failing to gather information before making a decision. And now, here she was, watching the very protocols she had helped write unravel before her eyes. Finally, Captain Reed stepped forward. His large frame blocked the aisle as he stopped at Maya's row. His gaze landed just above her head, as though he were addressing the seat back instead of the woman in it. "Ma'am," he began, his baritone deep and resonant. "I'm Captain Reed. I've been informed that you've been refusing to comply with crew instructions and that your behavior is becoming disruptive. This cannot continue. The word disruptive sliced through the air, carrying with it all the venom of accusation. Passengers shifted again, some whispering, others exchanging looks that said, "Ah, so that's what this is." The framing was complete. Maya was not a woman calmly defending her rights. She was a problem. Maya turned her head slowly, her gaze meeting Reed's at last. Her voice was quiet, controlled, but edged with steel. "Captain, with respect, I have not been disruptive. I've been sitting in my assigned seat, reading quietly. A passenger asked me to move. I declined. Your crew has escalated this matter unnecessarily and misrepresented my behavior." Reed's jaw flexed. His eyes flicked briefly toward Bradley, then back to Maya. He was a man caught between his perception of authority and his need to maintain order. "My crew are experienced professionals," he said firmly. "I trust their judgment. If they say you are refusing to comply, then you are refusing. Now, are you going to move to the other seat, or are we going to have a problem?" The cabin held its breath. Every word echoed too loudly in the silence. Clara's hands tightened into fists on her lap. She wanted to shout the truth that Maya had been calm, dignified, that Bradley had been the one pushing, demanding, but her voice stayed locked in her throat. She could already picture Bradley's reaction if she spoke up. The glares in the office, the undermining, the whispered comments in meetings. She stared at her knees, hating herself for the paralysis. Maya, meanwhile, felt the weight of the decision pressing down like gravity. The captain's words were not just a request. They were a threat cloaked in official authority. She could comply and surrender her dignity, or she could resist and risk being removed. She heard her own heartbeat in her ears, steady and insistent. She thought of the countless women and men who had faced moments like this, forced to weigh their humanity against the comfort of others. She thought of every lecture she had given about leadership, about fairness, about respect, and she thought of Clara, the young woman sitting trapped by fear, watching silently. If Maya yielded now, what would that teach her? Her voice, when it came, was low but carried to every ear in the cabin. "No, Captain, I will not move. I have done nothing wrong. The problem is not mine to fix." A ripple moved through the passengers. Some frowned, disapproving. Others looked startled, even impressed. Bradley sneered, his smirk curling back into place as if he were already anticipating her downfall. Reed's eyes narrowed. He had expected resistance to crumble beneath his authority. Instead, it had hardened, and in that moment, his pride bristled. Backing down now would mean losing face not just with his crew, but with an entire cabin of witnesses. "Very well," he said, his voice cold. "If you refuse to comply with my instructions, then you leave me no choice. I'll have security escort you from this aircraft." The words landed like a gavel striking wood. Maya sat still, her face serene, but inside, her heart sank. She had known this was coming. Still, the sting of it cut deep. To be cast as a threat, a disruption, for simply existing in the place she had every right to be, it was an insult, an erasure. Clara bit her lip hard, tasting blood. Her hands itched to shoot up, to say something, anything, but fear pinned her to her seat. She whispered to herself, so low no one could hear, "I'm sorry." Maya gathered her belongings with deliberate care, folding her blazer neatly, tucking her notebook into her bag. Each movement was precise, almost ceremonial. She was not rushing, She was sending a message with every calm gesture: "You have not broken me." And as she rose to her feet, the cabin watched, silent and complicit, as Dignity was walked toward the door. The first-class cabin had never felt so small. The plush seats, the dimmed lights, the faint aroma of warmed bread rolls, all of it dissolved into a single oppressive silence as Captain Douglas Reed delivered his ultimatum. His words were final, wrapped in the weight of federal authority: comply, or be removed. For a moment, the entire aircraft seemed to hold its breath. No one moved, no one spoke. Even the engine's steady hum faded into the background, overshadowed by the charged tension that clung to every surface. All eyes fixed on Dr. Maya Ellison. Maya sat still, her notebook already tucked neatly into her bag, her blazer folded across her lap. Her face revealed nothing, not the sting of humiliation, not the anger pressing like fire against her chest. She had long ago mastered the art of wearing calmness like armor. But inside, her heart ached with a heavy familiarity. She had known this might happen. She had felt it in the flight attendant's tone, in the purser's framing, in the captain's refusal to see her. The verdict had been written long before he spoke it aloud. Bradley Stone leaned back in the aisle, arms folded across his chest, a smirk carved into his face. He didn't bother hiding it. To him, this was victory confirmation that his insistence had carried more weight than her dignity. Clara Jensen sat frozen beside Maya's now empty seat, her face pale, her eyes shimmering with conflict. She wanted to speak, to stop what was happening, but her voice was locked behind a wall of fear. Her fingers trembled against the edge of her laptop, nails digging into the plastic as if to ground herself. Captain Reed stepped slightly aside, nodding to Thomas Grant. The purser gave a crisp gesture toward the front, and within seconds, 2 security officers appeared in the doorway. They weren't aggressive, their expressions were neutral, their presence calm but undeniable. Still, their arrival was the final, humiliating punctuation of the captain's declaration. "Ma'am," one officer said softly, "please gather your things. We'll escort you off the plane." Maya rose slowly, deliberately, her movements precise. She slid her blazer into the crook of her arm, looped her bag strap over her shoulder, and wound her headphone cord into a perfect circle before slipping it into her pocket. She would not let them rush her. Every gesture was intentional. A silent message: you may strip me of this seat, but you will not strip me of my composure. The cabin watched. Passengers stared over the tops of their phones, some eyes wide with discomfort, others hardened with smug approval. A few glanced away quickly, unwilling to meet her gaze, unwilling to admit their complicity. To them, she was already cast in the role of problem passenger, and they were grateful it wasn't them. One man muttered under his breath, just loud enough for his seatmate to hear, "Should have just moved. Would have saved us all this trouble." His companion gave a small shrug, eyes fixed firmly on the ceiling. Maya's gaze swept the cabin once. She saw the avoidance, the discomfort, the indifference. But she also saw Clara. Clara's eyes were wide, glistening, her lips parted as if she might speak. She met Maya's gaze, and in that silent exchange, Maya felt both apology and admiration. The young woman wanted to stand beside her, but was trapped by her own fear. Maya held her eyes for a moment longer, a silent reassurance: "I understand. This fight isn't yours to carry today." Bradley's smirk deepened as Maya stepped into the aisle. He shifted slightly, making a show of moving his legs to give her space, as though he were granting her passage. He leaned just close enough to murmur, "Some people don't know when to give in." Maya did not even look at him. He was not the problem. He was a symptom, and symptoms only mattered insofar as they revealed the disease. The two officers flanked her politely, not touching her, simply guiding her forward. Still, their presence was enough to frame the moment as one of disgrace. Passengers' eyes followed her every step, the weight of their stares pressing against her back. The aisle, once wide, now felt like a gauntlet. The young flight attendant in row 4 whispered to a colleague, "She's the disruptive one." Her voice carried disbelief, but it was swallowed quickly by the silence that followed. Few wanted to voice doubt, not when the captain had spoken. Maya's steps were steady. Each footfall echoed like a metronome, marking the rhythm of her dignity. She would not let them see her stumble. She would not let them see her broken. As she reached the front of the cabin, she turned her head slightly, her voice calm but carrying just enough to reach the captain and purser standing near the galley. "You are making a mistake," she said, her tone quiet but resonant, "and I promise you, before this night is over, you will know it." Captain Reed's lips curled into something between a scoff and a smirk, but he said nothing. Thomas Grant's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking away. Monica Reeves stood stiffly beside them, her arms crossed, her expression composed but brittle. The jet bridge door opened with a mechanical hiss. Cool air from the terminal spilled into the cabin, mingling with the recycled air of the aircraft. The sound was final, definitive, like the closing of a chapter. Maya stepped across the threshold, her posture upright, her head high. Behind her, the cabin exhaled in unison, a mix of relief and discomfort. The door shut with a heavy click, sealing her on the outside, inside. Passengers shifted in their seats, murmurs bubbling up. Some condemned her in hushed tones. Others wondered aloud why the captain had been forced to intervene. A few shook their heads, sensing the injustice but unwilling to carry it further. Clara stared at the empty seat beside her, her chest tightening. She had just witnessed something she knew was wrong, and she had done nothing. The guilt gnawed at her, sharp and relentless. She wanted to believe she had no choice, but deep down, she knew silence had been a choice all its own. Bradley leaned toward her, his voice smug and satisfied. "Now we can finally get some work done." Clara's stomach churned. She didn't even open her laptop. Back in the jet bridge, Maya paused for a moment. The two officers waited silently, expecting her to continue toward the terminal. But she stood still, her hand resting lightly on the strap of her bag. Through the thick glass, she could see the silhouette of the cockpit. Captain Reed's head bent over his controls, confident the problem had been removed. But he had miscalculated. All of them had, because Maya Ellison knew the weight of the protocols they had just violated. She knew the reach of the people in her contacts list, and she knew that her power had never been tied to a seat on a plane. Her power was waiting just beyond the walls of this aircraft. The officers exchanged uncertain glances. One finally cleared his throat. "This way, ma'am," he said, gesturing toward the terminal. Maya gave the faintest nod. "One moment, please." She slipped her phone from her bag, her fingers steady as she scrolled through her contacts. Her eyes never left the aircraft through the window. She already knew the call she was about to make would change the course of this night, not just for her, but for every person still seated inside that plane. The air on the jet bridge was colder than inside the cabin, a sterile draft laced with the faint scent of fuel and industrial cleaner. The door behind her sealed with a hiss, and the murmur of passengers disappeared. For the first time since the confrontation began, Dr. Maya Ellison stood alone, flanked only by the two security officers who had escorted her out. They weren't hostile, merely procedural. Still, their presence carried an edge of finality. To them, this was over a disruptive passenger removed, a flight ready to depart. But Maya knew otherwise. This wasn't an ending. It was the opening of another, larger door. One officer gestured toward the terminal. "This way, ma'am. We'll guide you back to the gate." Maya lifted her hand slightly. "One moment, please." She set her bag down carefully on the bench built into the jet bridge wall and retrieved her phone. The screen lit up, a flood of notifications vying for her attention. But she ignored them all. Her thumb scrolled through contacts with the precision of someone who already knew exactly whom she was searching for. The name appeared Jordan Blake. She pressed call. The line clicked after one ring. A familiar voice answered, deep and brisk, but softened by recognition. "Dr. Ellison, I thought you'd be airborne by now. Is everything all right?" Maya's eyes remained fixed on the plane visible through the thick glass window. She could see the nose of the Dreamliner, its lights glowing faintly, the ground crew disconnecting the last cables. She imagined Captain Douglas Reed in the cockpit, confident he had silenced the problem. Her voice was calm, deliberate. "Jordan, I'm calling to report a Level 1 safety protocol breach on SkyWest Global Flight 729 Gate D17. Silence on the line, heavy and sharp. Jordan Blake was not a man easily rattled, but those words carried the weight of thunder. "Level 1, he repeated, his tone instantly stripped of all pleasantries. "Dr. Ellison, what exactly are you observing mechanical fault security threat?" "The threat," Maya said, letting a sliver of steel thread her voice, "is in the cockpit. I have just been personally ejected from that aircraft by Captain Douglas Reed. The grounds, according to him, were that I posed a safety risk. In truth, I was a paying passenger who refused to give up her seat to an entitled businessman. The crew escalated it. The purser misrepresented my behavior, and the captain made a decision without speaking to me directly, without de-escalation, and without following the mandatory conflict management directive." Another pause. When Jordan spoke again, his voice was granite. "You're telling me the captain removed a passenger based on second-hand accusations, without following the 7B directive?" "Yes," Maya said. "The directive you and I wrote, the one I'd trained you on, the one every crew operating from this terminal is federally required to uphold." Jordan swore under his breath, a low, violent sound. "Where are you right now?" "Still on the jet bridge. They're preparing to push back, through the window." Maya saw the tug ease into position, the blinking yellow lights of the ground vehicle reflected against the aircraft's curved fuselage. She could see passengers through the first-class windows, some settling back, others peering curiously. "They're not going anywhere," Jordan said. His voice was steady now, a commander slipping into full control. "I'm issuing a tarmac stop on Flight 729 immediately. Critical command crew review. Effective now." Maya watched as, almost instantly, an airport operations vehicle with flashing lights pulled up near the nose of the aircraft. The tug stopped abruptly. A man in a high-visibility jacket began waving his arms, signaling the cockpit. The aircraft, which had been moments from rolling, was suddenly frozen in place. A flicker of grim satisfaction touched Maya's lips. "I see your handiwork already." "This isn't mine," Jordan replied. "It's yours. A Level 1 report from you is equivalent to a direct FAA mandate. You just grounded that flight." The two security officers exchanged uncertain glances. They had escorted a passenger off an aircraft, expecting the matter to end there. Now, they watched as the largest plane on the tarmac sat immobile under flashing lights, all because of the woman standing calmly with her phone. Maya slipped her blazer more firmly over her arm. "Jordan, you understand what this means?" "I do," he said grimly. "If SkyWest Global's command crews can't follow protocol, this isn't about one plane. This terminal's entire certification is at stake. And since you're the lead auditor, your report will carry the full weight of enforcement." Maya's gaze remained on the aircraft. She could almost feel the confusion boiling inside the cabin. Captain Reed would be glaring at his instruments, wondering why his clearance hadn't come. Bradley Stone would be gloating in his seat, unaware that his victory had already crumbled beneath him. Clara Jensen. Yes, Maya thought of Clara. With her pale face and trembling hands, Clara would be staring at the empty seat beside her, wondering what it meant that the woman who refused to move had vanished so quietly. But Maya hadn't vanished. She was here, and the storm was just beginning. Jordan's voice cut back through her thoughts. "Stay where you are. My team is en route to the gate. We'll meet you in the jet bridge. From this moment on, no one speaks to that crew without going through me. And, Dr. Ellison, thank you for making the call. If they treated you like this, God knows how many others they've silenced." Maya's throat tightened briefly, but she pushed it down. "Then let's make sure they silence no one else." The call ended. Outside, the plane's engine still hummed, restless, eager to depart. But the blinking yellow lights of the operations trucks told a different story. The passengers inside could sense it too. The pause, the delay, the way the aircraft refused to push back. Murmurs began to ripple through the cabin. Confusion replaced complacency. In the cockpit, Captain Reed's hand gripped the radio controls, his knuckles white. The words from the tower were like ice water poured over his confidence. SkyWest 729 hold position. Tarmac stop in effect. Reason cited critical command crew review. Do not depart. "What the hell does that mean?" Reed muttered, his voice sharp. His first officer, younger, anxious, glanced at him. "It means someone questioned your authority. Command crew review. That's FAA level." Reed's stomach dropped. His authority, unquestioned for decades, was suddenly suspended mid-air before the plane even left the ground. And when he looked out the cockpit window, he saw them operations officials gathering near the jet bridge, dark suits moving with purpose, and at their center, walking calmly with a phone still in her hand, was Dr. Maya Ellison. The sick weight in his stomach grew heavier. He realized, too late, that the passenger he had dismissed as a disruption was the one person with the power to bring his entire flight and perhaps his career to a standstill. Back on the jet bridge, Maya slipped her phone into her bag. She looked at the two officers beside her, who now regarded her with something between respect and bewilderment. They had escorted her off in silence. Now they understood the woman they thought was powerless had just stopped the largest aircraft on the tarmac with a single phone call. Her voice was quiet, but resolute. "Gentlemen, you may want to stay close. Things are about to get complicated." The jet bridge vibrated faintly under the weight of hurried footsteps. A cluster of officials in dark suits advanced toward the aircraft door, their badges glinting under the fluorescent lights. At their center walked Jordan Blake, tall and broad-shouldered, his presence radiating the kind of authority that silenced questions before they were spoken. Beside him, calm and unhurried, was Dr. Maya Ellison. She did not stride with anger. She moved with the serene assurance of someone who already knew the outcome. Her bag hung neatly on her shoulder, her blazer draped across her arm, as if she were walking into a lecture hall rather than back onto the aircraft that had just expelled her. The two security officers followed a pace behind, clearly unsure whether they were witnesses, escorts, or students in a lesson that was quickly growing larger than their pay grade. When the cabin door opened again, a hush fell over the first-class section. Passengers who had just begun to relax into the illusion of departure sat upright once more. The sight of Maya returning, side by side with the man every airport employee recognized as the director of operations, sent a ripple of shock through the cabin. Bradley Stone's smirk collapsed instantly, replaced by a flicker of confusion. Clara Jensen's breath caught in her throat. Monica Reeves, standing near the galley, froze with a coffee pot halfway to a cup. And Captain Douglas Reed, emerging reluctantly from the cockpit, felt the weight of dread sink like lead into his chest. Jordan stopped just inside the cabin, his voice calm but carrying with the authority of a man who controlled runways and gates with a phone call. "Captain Reed, my name is Jordan Blake, Director of Operations for this airport. We need to have a word." Reed's jaw tightened. He glanced at Thomas Grant, who shifted uneasily, then back at Jordan. "Director Blake," he said, his tone stiff. "This is highly irregular. We were preparing for departure." "Your departure has been suspended," Jordan replied, his eyes unwavering. "Flight 729 is grounded pending a command crew review, and we'll be conducting that review right here, right now." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Passengers exchanged wide-eyed looks, sensing the drama that had seemed concluded was only beginning its second act. Jordan turned slightly, gesturing toward Maya. "This is Dr. Maya Ellison. I believe you've already met." For the first time, Captain Reed met her eyes directly. The recognition was slow, dawning with painful clarity. He had dismissed her as a nuisance, cast her out as a disruption. Now she stood before him, not as a passenger, but as the federal safety auditor whose name appeared on the very directives that governed his profession. Maya inclined her head slightly, her tone calm, measured, but cutting in its precision. "Captain Reed, I am the lead author of the 7B Conflict Management Directive, the very protocol you and your crew violated tonight." The words landed like stones dropped into still water, sending shock waves outward. Bradley Stone shifted in his seat, suddenly aware that the ground beneath him was collapsing. Clara Jensen's eyes widened with something between awe and relief, and Monica Reeves looked as though the floor had just tilted beneath her feet. Jordan's voice filled the silence. "Based on Dr. Ellison's report, I'm citing your crew for a catastrophic breach of judgment. You escalated a seating dispute into a passenger removal without following mandatory de-escalation steps, effective immediately. This flight is grounded, and your crew will be escorted for formal interviews." Reed's face flushed a deep crimson. "This is outrageous," he snapped. I exercise my authority as captain to maintain order. That is my prerogative under federal law." Maya's voice cut through, calm but sharp enough to slice his protest in two. Authority without accountability is not leadership. "Captain, you did not maintain order. You abused it, and you did so at the expense of both safety and truth." The surrounding passengers watched in stunned silence. For the first time, the narrative had shifted. The woman they had seen escorted off as a problem was now the one wielding undeniable power, speaking with a clarity that made the air itself vibrate. Thomas Grant cleared his throat, his voice wavering. "We were acting on the information available to us." The passenger, Mr. Stone, was adamant Jordan turned his gaze on him, and Thomas faltered under the weight of it. "Mr. Grant, your role was to de-escalate, not amplify. Instead, you misrepresented a calm refusal as a disruption and poisoned the captain's judgment before he even spoke to Dr. Ellison. That failure is documented, and it will be dealt with." Monica Reeves swallowed hard, her earlier condescension now brittle and exposed. She looked from Jordan to Maya, searching for an escape, but there was none. Jordan shifted his focus to Bradley Stone, who sat rigid in seat 2A. "And you, sir, you were the instigator of this incident. You will provide a full statement before you leave this terminal. I suggest you consider your words carefully. The FAA will review them." Bradley's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to argue, but no sound came. The bravado that had filled his voice earlier evaporated, leaving only the hollow shell of entitlement stripped bare. Clara Jensen sat motionless, her chest tight. For the first time, she allowed herself to meet Maya's gaze again. There was no accusation in Maya's eyes, no bitterness, only a quiet strength that made Clara's throat burn with regret. She realized she had been holding her breath for hours, and now, at last, she exhaled. Jordan stepped back slightly, allowing Maya to take a half-step forward. Her voice was soft but carried to every ear in the cabin. What happened here tonight was not about a seat. It was about respect. About whether any person can exist in this space without being asked to surrender their dignity for someone else's convenience. And every one of you has now witnessed what happens when those in power forget their duty to fairness. The silence that followed was profound. Some passengers lowered their eyes, ashamed. Others looked at her with something approaching reverence. Clara felt tears sting her eyes, not from sadness, but from the sudden, overwhelming recognition that she had just witnessed courage in its purest form. Captain Reed's mouth opened as if to respond, but Jordan raised a hand. Silence in him. "Save it for your interview, Captain. For now, gather your crew. You will not be flying this plane tonight." The finality in his voice was absolute. Maya stepped back, her posture straight, her calmness unshaken. She no longer felt the sting of humiliation from being escorted out. That walk down the aisle had been their attempt to break her. Now, standing here with Jordan at her side, she knew they had only broken themselves. Bradley shifted uneasily, shrinking into his seat. Clara straightened slightly, her spine stiffening as though Maya's strength had lent her some of its fire. Monica stared down at the floor, her hands twisting nervously, and Captain Reed stood in silence, the weight of his ruined authority pressing heavily onto his shoulders. The drama of the evening was not over. There would be statements, investigations, consequences that rippled far beyond this cabin. But in this moment, the tide had turned, and every witness in that first-class cabin knew it. Maya Ellison had been escorted off as a problem. She had returned as the reckoning. The sterile corridors of the Airport Operations Center felt colder than the jet bridge had. Fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead, throwing sharp shadows against walls painted the color of old paper. The atmosphere was frigid, not only because of the air conditioning but because of what the building represented accountability. Every passenger removed from Flight 729 had been rescheduled, rerouted, or accommodated elsewhere. The terminal had calmed into a hushed chaos of rebook encounters and muted complaints. But in the heart of the operations center, there was no noise, only the quiet, methodical machinery of an investigation beginning to grind forward. Dr. Maya Ellison had been given a small office, a courtesy reserved for her position and her federal authority. A pot of untouched coffee steamed gently on the side table, its scent curling into the air. But Maya ignored it. She sat at the desk, posture straight, pen moving steadily across lined paper as she wrote her statement, every word precise, every phrase chosen carefully. She had no need for embellishment. The truth was damning enough. Outside her door, the interrogations began. Monica Reeves was the first. She entered the conference room, still in uniform, shoulders squared, chin high, as if she could bluff her way through with the confidence that had once carried her through countless flights. She sat across from two investigators, one from the FAA, the other from the Port Authority, both with notepads open, pens poised. Ms. Reeves, the FAA investigator, began. "Walk us through what happened in the cabin." Monica smoothed her skirt, buying time. "I was attempting to manage a situation between two passengers. Mr. Stone needed to sit beside his colleague to complete urgent work. Dr. Ellison refused to cooperate. She was being stubborn, uncooperative." The Port Authority investigator leaned forward. Was she raising her voice? No, Monica admitted. Not exactly raising her voice, but her tone was firm, defiant. "Did she threaten you? Use abusive language?" Monica's lips pressed together. "No," but the FAA investigator cut her off. So, to clarify, she was sitting in her assigned seat, quietly, and refused to give it up when asked. That was the entirety of her so-called disruption. Monica's confidence faltered. She twisted the tissue in her hands. I was trying to prevent escalation. Sometimes you have to make judgment calls in the moment. It seems to us," the Port Authority man said flatly, "that you escalated it. You sided with the demanding passenger, ignored the rights of another, and mischaracterized her calm refusal as disruptive behavior. Is that not what happened?" Monica's breath hitched. The shield of authority she had wrapped around herself crumbled. Tears welled, but they were not tears of remorse, only fear. Fear for her career, her pension, the fragile structure of identity she had built over 2 decades in uniform. Her voice cracked. "I've been flying for 25 years. I've given my life to this job." "Then you should have known better," the FAA investigator said coldly. Thomas Grant was next. He entered the room with the stiff posture of a man who still believed in procedure as armor. His tie was perfectly knotted, his shoes polished, but sweat glistened at his temples. "Mr. Grant," one investigator began, "you were the purser in charge of the cabin. You escalated this matter to the captain." Why Thomas's jaw tightened. "I was acting on the information given to me by my flight attendant. I trusted her judgment. She reported that the passenger was being uncooperative. Did you speak to Dr. Ellison yourself before involving the captain? Thomas hesitated. No, events were moving quickly. I needed to support my crew. You backed a misrepresentation, the investigator said bluntly. And in doing so, you violated multiple steps of the de-escalation protocol. You didn't observe. You didn't listen. You simply escalated. That isn't leadership, Mr. Grant. That's abdication. Thomas's carefully constructed mask cracked. His shoulders sagged. He looked down at his folded hands, words failing him. For years, he had relied on authority as a shield, believing his position insulated him from scrutiny. But under the fluorescent glare of accountability, there was no shield, only failure laid bare. Captain Douglas Reed faced the harshest room. He sat opposite Jordan Blake himself, alongside a senior FAA official flown in within the hour. A union representative sat beside Reed, but even his presence could not soften the weight in the air. Captain Reed, the FAA official said, his voice like steel, walk us through your decision-making process. Reed's voice was hoarse. He recounted how he had been briefed by his purser and attendant, how he had understood the situation as a disruptive passenger refusing compliance. He admitted he had not spoken to Dr. Ellison directly before ordering her removal. Jordan's voice cut through. You looked at a calm woman in her seat and deemed her a safety risk. Why, Reed's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. Because my crew, your crew, felt. Jordan interrupted, his voice rising, and you acted without assessing. You are a captain. You are the final backstop against foolishness. And tonight, you rubber-stamped it. Reed slumped in his chair, shame seeping into his bones. For 30 years he had worn his uniform like a crown, his command unquestioned. Now, stripped beneath the fluorescent light, he looked less like a commander and more like a man who had confused pride with wisdom. Bradley Stone arrived in the operations center full of bluster, demanding lawyers, complaining about delays, his voice sharp and entitled, but when informed that he was now part of a federal investigation, his tone shifted. His company had already been contacted. His role as instigator had been noted. His lawyer advised him to cooperate. So he did pathetically. I didn't think it was a big deal. He said, it was just one seat. My meeting was important. Millions were on the line. The investigator's voice was icy, and you believed your meeting outweighed another passenger's dignity. Outweighed federal regulations. Bradley flushed, stammered, fell silent. The arrogance drained from him, leaving only the small, trembling shape of a man who had thought the world would always bend to his will. Maya finished her statement in silence. She laid her pen down, reread the words, then signed at the bottom with a steady hand. Her report was not emotional. It was factual, and it was devastating. As the night deepened, the pieces of the evening fell into place: testimonies, contradictions, the crumbling facades of authority. Maya walked the corridor once more, her steps measured, her calmness unshaken. She had no need to gloat. The truth was doing that work for her. For every B.R. Adley Stone who smirked, for every Monica Reeves who condescended, for every Thomas Grant who abdicated, for every Douglas Reed who wielded authority without accountability, there was now a reckoning, and she, Maya Ellison, had simply chosen not to look away. By dawn, the airport hummed with the rhythm of a sleepless city. Announcements echoed across terminals, Carts of luggage rumbled over tiled floors, and the ever-present scent of burnt coffee mingled with jet fuel drifting in from the runways. But within the sterile walls of the operations center, silence had ruled through the night. Dr. Maya Ellison stepped out of the small office where she had written her report. The sky outside the glass corridors had begun to pale, streaks of pink and orange cutting across the horizon. She carried herself with the same composure she had worn in the cabin, calm, deliberate, unbroken. The weight of the night was heavy, but it had not bent her. Jordan Blake met her at the corridor junction. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie loosened, but his eyes were sharp, awake with the urgency of a man balancing the fate of an entire terminal. "Your report is filed," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "The FAA already has it. They're moving fast." Maya inclined her head slightly. "They should. This was never just about me. It's about whether the people entrusted with authority can be trusted at all." Jordan exhaled, almost a sigh. "You've just pulled the thread on something much bigger than one flight, and the unraveling has already started." He wasn't exaggerating. Across the terminal, a young tech blogger who had been seated in business class the night before uploaded a 3-minute video to his social feed. He had recorded discreetly, his phone angled just enough to capture the confrontation, Maya's calm refusal, Bradley Stone's entitled huffing, Monica Reeves's condescension, and finally Captain Douglas Reed invoking safety risk like a hammer. The video ended with Maya gathering her belongings with quiet dignity, walking the aisle under the weight of judgmental stares. The title he gave it was simple: Biting Class Act versus Classless Crew. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, the video had spread like fire through dry grass. Hashtags bloomed: Justice for Maya, Receipt 709, Fly with Respect. Comments flooded in from around the world. She's the calmest person in the room, and they call her disruptive. This is why implicit bias training matters. That captain failed at square one. Respect to Dr. Ellison, Grace under fire, absolute queen. The video leapt from social feeds to morning news broadcasts. Anchors replayed the footage, shaking their heads in disbelief, contrasting Maya's serenity with the escalating aggression of those around her. Within hours, every major network carried the headline, "Black Woman Escorted Off Plane." 10 minutes later, she shut down the runway. Meanwhile, in the operations center, the fallout accelerated. Bradley Stone sat in a holding room with his lawyer, his phone buzzing with messages he dared not open. His company's PR team was already in meltdown, their carefully cultivated image of inclusivity collapsing under the weight of a viral scandal tied to his name. Clara Jensen sat in another room, head in her hands. She'd been asked for a statement, and she had given one truthful, unvarnished. For the first time, she had spoken aloud what she had witnessed, that Maya Ellison had been calm, reasonable, and wronged. Her words, combined with the viral video, painted a devastatingly clear picture. And in the corner of her mind, Clara felt both guilt and relief. Guilt that she had not spoken up when it mattered most. Relief that at least now her voice might help repair some of the damage. At SkyWest Global's headquarters in Chicago, the boardroom vibrated with fury. Executives crowded around a large screen displaying live news coverage, their faces pale as the numbers scrolled across the bottom stock prices plunging. Hashtags trending. Anchors dissecting every second of the footage. "This is catastrophic," one board member hissed, Billions in market cap evaporated overnight. The CEO, Richard Holloway, pinched the bridge of his nose. We need to get ahead of this. Issue a statement, full apology, suspension of the crew, something, anything, not enough. Another board member shot back. She's not just any passenger. She's Dr. Maya Ellison. Do you understand who that is? The FAA listens to her. Regulators know her name. If she writes in her report that our crews are unsafe, we're grounded, period. The room fell into grim silence. D. Back at the airport. Maya walked through the terminal with Jordan at her side. Passengers whispered as she passed, recognition spreading faster than rumor. Some approached her hesitantly, offering words of support. "Thank you for standing your ground," a woman said softly, clutching the hand of her teenage daughter. She needed to see someone do that. Maya smiled gently, placing a hand over the girl's. "Never let anyone tell you that your place is smaller than theirs," she said, her voice warm but steady. The girl's eyes widened, and she nodded fiercely, as though storing the words like armor. Jordan glanced at Maya as they walked on. "You realize you've become a symbol now?" Maya shook her head. "Symbols are dangerous. People project what they want. I'm just a woman who refused to give up her seat." Jordan gave a humorless laugh. "Maybe, but you also grounded the most powerful airline in this terminal. That doesn't happen quietly." Inside news studios across the country, experts dissected the footage, bringing in aviation analysts, diversity trainers, and even former pilots. Some defended Captain Reed, claiming he had acted within his authority. But their arguments collapsed against the weight of the directive Maya herself had authored. One anchor put it bluntly. This wasn't just poor judgment. This was systemic bias at 30,000 feet. And thanks to Dr. Ellison, the system is finally being held accountable. Late that morning, as Maya sat once more in the quiet of the operations office, her phone buzzed with a call. The name on the screen made her pause. Richard Holloway, CEO of SkyWest Global. She answered calmly. "Mr. Holloway?" His voice was thick with contrition, practiced and smooth. "Dr. Ellison, on behalf of SkyWest Global, I want to personally extend our deepest apologies for the incident last night. What you experienced was unacceptable. I assure you, we are taking immediate action." Maya cut him off gently, but firmly. "Mr. Holloway, spare the platitudes. This wasn't a fluke. It was a symptom. You don't fix symptoms. You treat the disease. Until you address the culture that produced this failure, your apologies are meaningless." There was silence on the line. Then, finally, a resigned exhale. "We'll be in touch." Maya hung up, her face unreadable. By afternoon, the story had crossed oceans. European news outlets replayed the footage. Asian carriers issued statements about their own protocols, and activists worldwide hailed Maya as a quiet force of change. But Maya herself sat in the airport office, sipping the now cold coffee at last. Her eyes were tired, but her spirit steady. She had not sought this fight. She had not asked to be made a symbol, but sometimes the fight found you, and when it did, the only choice was whether to stand or to yield. She had chosen to stand, and because of that choice, the entire world was now watching. The hours that followed were a master class in dismantling. The events of one flight metastasized into an airline-wide crisis, spreading through newsrooms, trading floors, and boardrooms like an unstoppable contagion. At JFK's operations center, the immediate interrogations ended. But the reverberations had only begun. Every word, every gesture from the night before was documented, cross-checked, and woven into reports that carried the weight of federal enforcement. The crew members, once clothed in the authority of their uniforms, were now stripped down to frightened employees clinging to explanations that no longer held. Monica Reeves was summoned to a sterile HR office at the airport hub. She walked in with shoulders hunched, eyes hollow from the sleepless night. She expected a reprimand, perhaps a suspension. She still believed herself unlucky, misunderstood, perhaps even the victim. The meeting lasted less than 5 minutes. Effective immediately, the HR officer said, voice flat. Your employment with Sky West Global is terminated. Your access credentials are revoked. Monica blinked, stunned. But 25 years. My pension. My benefits. Your conduct last night was in direct violation of FAA regulations and federal directives. The officer cut her off. Your image has already gone viral. You are a liability. Her breath caught in her throat. Her career, the only identity she had ever known, collapsed with a single sheet of paper slid across the table. The uniform that once gave her authority was now her shackle. She walked out of the room not as a stewardess of power, but as a cautionary tale. Thomas Grant faced a longer, colder meeting. As purser, he had believed his seniority shielded him. But the investigator's report laid his failures bare. He had not de-escalated, had not verified facts, had not fulfilled the very duty his position demanded. In the HR conference room, he tried to mount a defense. I was following procedure. I backed my crew. The HR director slid the report across the desk. No, Mr. Grant, you bypassed procedure. You backed a lie. You failed to lead. That's not procedure. That's negligence. Thomas swallowed hard, his voice fading to a whisper. I gave 30 years to this airline. Then you should have known better. The director replied. By the end of the day, his airport access badge no longer worked. He left the building carrying a box of personal items, his authority reduced to nothing but a fragile memory. For Captain Douglas Reed, the fall was even harder. As a senior captain, he was protected by a powerful union, but even they could not shield him from the FAA. His license was suspended pending a full psychiatric and competency review. In the weeks that followed, the proud pilot who once commanded Dreamliners found himself in a fluorescent classroom in Oklahoma City, listening to a 28-year-old psychologist lecture on microaggressions and de-escalation. His peers, other captains, looked at him with a mixture of pity and disdain. He had broken the cardinal rule never allow cabin disputes to compromise command. His pride curdled into corrosive shame. He would never again command the skies. Bradley Stone's downfall was swifter and public. His name, unredacted in leaked FAA notes, became synonymous with arrogance. Screenshots of his LinkedIn profile circulated online with mocking captions. Hashtags tied his name to greed, entitlement, and bias. At his company, Eldridge Capital, executives raged behind closed doors. Their European merger partner had already pulled out, citing leadership culture concerns. Hundreds of millions evaporated overnight. Bradley was summoned to a meeting with the firm's chief counsel and head of HR. The verdict was short and merciless. Your actions on Flight 729 brought this company into disrepute. The counsel said, you've cost us clients, capital, and credibility, effective immediately. Your employment is terminated. Bradley opened his mouth to argue, but the HR officer pushed a folder toward him. Inside was a letter of dismissal and a severance package stripped to the bone. His security badge was deactivated before the meeting ended. By the time he left the building, his email was gone, his office reassigned, his name erased from the company directory. He had demanded someone else's seat. In the end, he lost every seat that mattered. Clara Jensen, however, found herself in an unexpected position. Weeks earlier, she had been the quiet junior associate, terrified of speaking against her boss. But her testimony had been damning and truthful. Eldridge Capital, desperate to salvage credibility, reviewed her record and promoted her. She inherited the very accounts Bradley had lost. When she walked into her new corner office, she paused by the window, staring out at the skyline. She thought of Maya Ellison's calm gaze, the unspoken understanding in that brief exchange in the cabin. Clara whispered quietly to herself, "She fought for me, too." At SkyWest Global Headquarters, the damage was existential. Stock values plummeted, lawsuits loomed, regulators circled like hawks. In a boardroom overlooking the Chicago skyline, executives debated desperately. The FAA's message had been blunt: no full operations until every crew, worldwide, completed retraining in de-escalation and bias management. And the irony cut deeper than any lawsuit. The firm chosen to design and oversee the retraining program was none other than the Washington Ellison Consultancy Group. Co-founded by Maya herself, it was elegant, it was devastating. The airline would now pay the very woman they had humiliated to rebuild the culture that had failed her. Richard Halloway, the CEO, stared out the glass windows, hands clenched behind his back. He had built his empire on prestige, on the illusion of luxury in the skies. Now, that empire was tethered to the judgment of the woman his employees had tried to dismiss as a nuisance. The humiliation was absolute. Haste. In the quiet of her home office, weeks later, Maya Ellison reflected not on triumph, but on consequence. She had not sought to ruin careers or topple companies. She had simply refused to surrender her dignity. But the dominoes had fallen nonetheless. She thought of Monica's tears, Thomas's sagging shoulders, Reed's hollow eyes, Bradley's collapse, Clara's timid gratitude. She felt no glee, only a profound sadness that it had taken humiliation and collapse for people to learn what decency should have taught them from the start. Yet she also felt a fierce clarity. This was the work she had dedicated her life to, building systems that kept people safe, not just mechanically, but morally. The sky could not be safe if its guardians were blind to their own bias. As she closed her notebook, she whispered to the silence of the room, "Respect isn't optional. Not on the ground, not in the air, not ever." The story of Flight 729 did not end at JFK, nor in the quiet HR offices where careers had collapsed. It spilled outward, across cities, countries, continents. What had begun as a single confrontation over a seat became a conversation the world could no longer avoid. Within a week, every major airline in the United States had issued new policy statements. They spoke of recommitment to fairness, of renewed focus on de-escalation, of zero tolerance for discriminatory practices. But the words were not born of sudden moral clarity. They were born of fear. Fear of being the next viral scandal. Fear of becoming the next SkyWest Global. Union leaders held emergency meetings. Flight attendant associations scrambled to launch retraining programs. Pilots whispered in crew lounges, suddenly aware that their once absolute authority could be scrutinized, questioned, overturned. In Europe, regulators announced they would review passenger rights frameworks, citing Flight 729 as a case study. In Asia, airlines quietly invited diversity consultants into their training centers. In Africa, columnists wrote about Maya Ellison as if she were a warrior who had fought not with fists or fury, but with stillness and law. News programs replayed the 3-minute video again and again, each frame dissected. Commentators marveled at Maya's composure, the way she folded her blazer with meticulous care, the way she spoke without raising her voice, the way her calmness became more powerful than the authority trying to silence her. She turned their performance into their undoing. One anchor said, "They expected outrage." She gave them dignity, and dignity is harder to dismiss. In Washington, congressional committees began murmuring about new oversight legislation. One senator held up a printout of the viral headline, "Black Woman Escorted Off Plane," 10 minutes later. She shut down the runway and declared, "If this can happen to Dr. Ellison, it can happen to anyone. Our skies must be safe for every citizen, not just the privileged few." The words struck chords across political aisles. For once, the issue was not partisan. It was human. For Maya, the sudden glare of global attention was disorienting. Journalists called her phone at all hours. Activists wanted her to speak at rallies. Airlines wanted to hire her consultancy overnight. But she did not crave microphones or stages. She returned quietly to her work, drafting training modules, advising regulators, mentoring young engineers. When asked for interviews, she chose sparingly. When she did speak, her words were measured, her voice calm. "I am not a symbol," she told one interviewer. "I am a person who refused to surrender her seat. If that refusal inspires others, then let it inspire them not to me, but to themselves. Every passenger has the right to dignity. Every worker has the duty to honor it." That is all. The clip of her saying those words aired on primetime television. Viewers across the globe repeated them like a mantra. Every passenger has the right to dignity. Bradley Stone, now unemployed and disgraced, became the dark mirror of the story. Articles detailed his downfall with brutal precision. His former colleagues spoke anonymously about his arrogance. Tabloids published photos of him leaving his apartment, face hidden under a baseball cap, as if shame were a disguise. For Clara Jensen, the ripple effect was different. She found herself invited onto panels about ethics in business, asked to describe what it felt like to witness injustice and stay silent. At first, her voice trembled. Then it grew stronger. "I didn't speak up when I should have," she admitted. "But because Dr. Ellison stood firm, I had a second chance to tell the truth. I will not waste that chance again." Her honesty resonated. She became a quiet advocate for corporate accountability, proof that even silence could be redeemed if followed by courage. Meanwhile, within SkyWest Global, the transformation was seismic. Entire divisions of training were rebuilt from the ground up. Consultants streamed through doors, diversity trainers, conflict resolution experts, psychologists, and at the helm of it all, quietly overseeing, was Maya's consultancy. Executives chafed at the irony, pilots bristled under the scrutiny, But the work went forward, relentless. Flight by flight, crew by crew, the culture shifted slowly, imperfectly, but undeniably. Passengers noticed, too. Weeks later, a woman in first class on a different airline refused to give up her seat under similar pressure. This time, the flight attendant apologized to the demanding passenger instead. "I'm sorry, sir," she said firmly, "but this seat belongs to her." Someone filmed it. The clip went viral with a new hashtag, the Maya Effect. Maya watched these developments with a mixture of relief and caution. She knew public attention was fickle. Today's outrage could become tomorrow's forgotten headline. But she also knew change, once begun, had a way of spreading beyond control at night in the quiet of her home. She reflected on the strange journey. She thought of the young girl in the terminal whose mother had thanked her. She thought of Clara's trembling smile when she finally told the truth. She thought of Jordan Blake, once her student, now her ally, standing beside her in the cabin as justice was revealed. She also thought of Monica, Thomas, and Reed not with hatred, but with a weary sadness. They had not been monsters. They had been ordinary people who let bias blind them. And yet, ordinary bias could wound as sharply as malice. Her conclusion was simple. Unshakable change did not come from punishment alone. It came from remembrance, from refusing to forget. By the end of that month, Maya's inbox overflowed with invitations. Universities wanted her to lecture. Corporations wanted her to consult. Activists wanted her to endorse campaigns. She accepted few. She chose carefully. She knew her voice carried weight now, but she also knew that power, like authority, demanded restraint. At a small conference in Boston, she finally agreed to speak. The room was filled with young engineers, pilots in training, and students of law. She stood at the podium, her salt and pepper hair catching the light, her pearl earrings understated but dignified. Her voice was calm, her cadence measured, like a symphony played on a single, steady note. "I'm often asked," she began, "how it felt to shut down a runway, but that is the wrong question. The question we should ask is, why did the runway need to be shut down at all? Why did a crew of professionals see a quiet woman as a threat? Why did silence outweigh decency in that cabin? Those questions matter more than what I felt, because the answers reveal the world we still have to change." The audience was silent, listening, hanging on her words. She paused, then continued. "Respect isn't something you demand, it's something you give. And when you refuse to give it, when you mistake arrogance for authority, the consequences will come whether in a viral video, a grounded flight, or the erosion of trust. The skies belong to all of us. They are only safe when they are fair." The room erupted in applause. Some stood, clapping with tears in their eyes. Maya bowed her head slightly, not with pride, but with quiet acknowledgement. Far beyond that conference hall, passengers boarded planes with new awareness. Some glanced at flight attendants with sharper eyes. Some whispered about Maya Ellison as though she were myth, a story retold at 30,000 feet. And though she would never call herself a symbol, she had become one nonetheless, a quiet force, a calm reckoning, a ripple that became a wave. The weeks turned into months, but the echo of Flight 729 refused to fade. News cycles had shifted, as they always did. But the story lived on, retold in classrooms, referenced in training manuals, whispered by passengers as they adjusted their seat belts. For Dr. Maya Ellison, life found its rhythm again, though never quite the same rhythm as before. She returned to her consultancy, drafting safety protocols, advising regulators, mentoring engineers, yet, wherever she went, the weight of recognition followed. Strangers approached her in airports, some hesitant, some emboldened, their words soft but urgent. "Thank you for not moving," one woman whispered in a departure lounge, clutching her boarding pass like a lifeline. "You reminded me I don't have to shrink." A young man in uniform, barely out of training, once stopped her near baggage claim. His eyes shone with earnest conviction. "Ma'am, I'm a new flight attendant. I promise I will never be a Monica Reeves. Not ever." Maya would smile gently, nodding. "Remember," she told him, "authority is not a weapon, it's a responsibility." Her words lived inside him long after she walked away. In the wider world, the ripple effect hardened into legacy. Airlines across continents implemented mandatory bias training. The FAA expanded oversight committees. Universities added the case of Flight 729 into their ethics syllabi. It became a landmark not only in aviation safety but in social accountability. And still, the video continued to circulate. Students watched it in dorm rooms. Lawyers cited it in courtrooms. Activists played it on protest screens. Each time, Maya's calm voice and deliberate movements told the story again, not with spectacle, but with the quiet undeniability of truth. Yet Maya herself never saw the story as triumph. Late at night, sitting by the window of her brownstone in San Francisco, she reflected with both pride and sorrow. She thought of Bradley Stone not with hatred, but as a reminder of entitlement unchecked. She thought of Clara Jensen, who had found her voice, and silently hoped the young woman would carry it forward. She thought of Monica Reeves and Thomas Grant, whose careers had collapsed not out of malice alone, but out of the slow corrosion of small prejudices left unchallenged. And she thought of Captain Douglas Reed, whose downfall hurt the most. For 3 decades, he had commanded the skies, yet in one night, he had mistaken arrogance for authority. She did not pity him. She pitied the world that had taught him power meant never questioning himself. Her sadness was not for the collapse of reputations, but for the truth that so much pain had been necessary to teach such simple lessons. One evening, Jordan Blake visited her office. The 2 old colleagues shared tea, their conversation quiet, unhurried. "Do you ever wish it hadn't happened?" Jordan asked softly. Maya looked into her cup, the steam curling upward like smoke. "I wish it hadn't needed to happen," she said, "but life rarely asks us what we wish. It asks us what we will do with what we're given." Jordan nodded. "And you turned it into a reckoning." Maya smiled faintly, though her eyes were weary. "I turned it into a reminder. Reckonings come and go, but reminders can last." Months later, she was invited to deliver a keynote at an international aviation summit in Geneva. The hall was filled with executives, regulators, and young trainees from across the world. As she stepped onto the stage, the room rose in a standing ovation before she had even spoken. She raised her hand gently, asking for quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice calm, deliberate, resonant. "The sky belongs to all of us, but too often, the right to dignity has been treated as a privilege instead of a guarantee. Flight 729 was not extraordinary because injustice occurred. Injustice occurs every day. It was extraordinary because the world finally saw it, and the world finally said, "No more." She paused, letting the silence settle like a weight. My lesson to you is simple. Respect is not optional, justice is not negotiable, and authority without accountability is nothing but tyranny in uniform. The words landed with the force of truth. Some in the audience looked shaken, some inspired, all attentive. Maya leaned slightly toward the microphone. I did not move from my seat that night because it was never just a seat. It was the ground where dignity stood, and I refused to surrender it. Every one of you will face moments perhaps not on a plane, perhaps not in public, but moments where you are asked to surrender something essential. I hope you remember, quiet defiance is not weakness, it is strength. The room erupted in applause again, waves of it rolling like thunder. Back home, sitting once more by her window overlooking the San Francisco Bay, Maya allowed herself a rare smile. She did not see herself as a hero, nor as a symbol. She saw herself as a woman who had chosen stillness over surrender, and that choice had become a legacy. The world had learned, not from shouting, not from chaos, but from the calm, unwavering voice of one passenger who would not be moved. And so, the story of Flight 729 endures not as a scandal, not as a viral video, but as a living reminder that respect is the foundation of justice, and justice is the lifeblood of every society that dares to call itself fair. Maya Ellison never asked to shut down a runway. But when the moment came, she did more than that. She opened a door, and through that door walked a new expectation that the skies, like the earth below, must be equal ground for every human being. The story of Flight 729 is not just about one woman and one flight. It is about what happens when bias is allowed to masquerade as authority, and when silence is chosen over courage. Dr. Maya Ellison didn't raise her voice. She didn't fight or shout. She simply refused to surrender her dignity. And in doing so, she exposed a system built on prejudice, forcing an entire industry to change. Her calm defiance reminds us of a powerful truth. Respect is not optional. Justice is not negotiable. When those in power misuse it, the consequences ripple far beyond one cabin, one flight, or one company. As we reflect on Maya's story, let us remember the passengers who stayed silent, the crew who failed their duty, and the quiet bravery of one woman who stood her ground. This is not just her legacy, it is a call to each of us. What would you do if it were your seat, your dignity, your silence that was demanded? If this story moved you, please like this video, share it widely, and subscribe to our channel. Together, let's keep telling stories that expose injustice, honor resilience, and remind the world that true power lies in integrity.